Imagine for a moment. How many times have you opened Facebook today? Maybe to see the latest news, like a friend's photo, or maybe just to pass the time. Now stop and think. What is actually happening when you connect? What's behind that simple blue interface that millions of people, including you, access every day? What if I told you that this platform, which seems so harmless, holds a terrifying secret that goes far beyond what you could imagine? In 2004, the world witnessed the emergence of one of the greatest technological phenomena in history. Mark Zuckerberg, a brilliant and visionary young man, introduced the world to a social network that promised to connect people, break down barriers, and revolutionize global communication. But what no one knew at the time, and few dare to suspect even today, is that behind this innovation, there was a much greater force, a force that does not originate on our planet. Now you may be wondering, what am I trying to suggest? That Facebook's resounding success was somehow influenced by something beyond human capacity? The answer, as difficult as it may be to accept, is yes. In tighter high-tech circles, there are long-standing rumors surrounding Zuckerberg and the real origins of Facebook. Rumors that speak of mysterious meetings, sleepless nights, and whispers of a deal that was sealed not just between humans, but between the creator of Facebook and forces that defy everything we know about the world. But why haven't you heard about it? Because the secret is kept under lock and key. Those who tried to expose the truth, well, let's just say they disappeared or were silenced in ways that only add to the mystery. So I ask you, do you really know what happens to your data? Do you know who or what is really controlling the flow of information you consume? What if I told you that everything you post, comment, and share is just a small piece of a larger and much more sinister plan designed with an intelligence that does not belong to our species? The story I'm about to reveal is not a conspiracy theory. It is not a fiction. It is a reality that few know about, but which is about to be unmasked. A reality that will forever change the way you see the digital world, and perhaps the very destiny of humanity. The first signs that something was wrong with Mark Zuckerberg didn't appear overnight. For many, he was always seen as a young prodigy, someone focused and determined in his goals. However, among those who lived closely with him, there was a feeling that was difficult to ignore. A strange uneasiness that hung in the air when he was around. The nightly meetings he used to have, away from the public eye, soon began to attract the attention of some people, especially close friends and colleagues. But no one dared to question it openly. After all, who would have the courage to confront such a brilliant mind? It was during the second half of 2003, while Facebook was still just an idea in development, that the first rumors emerged. Mark, who normally maintained a predictable routine, began acting strangely. He would leave in the middle of the night, sometimes for hours at a time, and return with a tense expression, as if he had just come from an intense negotiation. When questioned by Eduardo or the other founders, he deflected the questions with a cold smile, always stating that he was working on something big. What few knew was that, deep in the dark nights, Mark Zuckerberg wasn't just working on a social media platform. He was encountering forces far beyond human control. Some of his roommates reported hearing strange voices in their apartment, but whenever they approached to investigate, the conversations would abruptly cease. And Mark? He never commented on these visits, preferring to change the subject whenever someone dared to ask. As the months went by, these nights out became more frequent, and Mark seemed more and more absorbed in his own thoughts. It wasn't uncommon to see him whispering to himself, as if he was in a silent discussion with someone, or something. Little by little, those around him began to pull away, feeling that there was something very wrong with him, but lacking the courage to find out what was really going on. And so, while Facebook was taking shape behind the scenes, another, darker narrative was unfolding in the shadows. Something that, at the time, few knew, but that would soon become impossible to ignore. It was during one of these nights that he, one of Mark's few friends who still remained close, decided to follow his instincts. Zuckerberg's behavior was too disturbing to ignore, and something inside him told him it was time to investigate what was behind these mysterious outings. That night, Mark left again as usual, quietly and without leaving a trace. But this time, the friend was prepared. Taking utmost care not to be seen, the protagonist followed Mark to the edge of the Harvard campus. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but a feeling of imminent danger overwhelmed him. As he walked, his mind filled with questions. What was Mark hiding? Could it be something related to the project? or something much bigger? As the terrain became more remote and isolated, he realized they were heading towards a part of the campus that was rarely frequented by students. Mark continued forward, moving with a strange precision, as if he knew exactly where he was going. It was then that something unusual happened. A strong, pulsating light appeared on the horizon, illuminating the sky above the forest. The protagonist stopped for a moment, frozen by fear, not knowing if he should continue. Against the instinct to flee, he advanced. As he got closer to the light, he saw a tall and slender figure, wrapped in a dark cloak, standing in front of Mark. The friend could hardly believe what he was seeing. The figure seemed almost ethereal, as if it did not belong to this world. His movements were slow and calculated, and his presence exuded an almost suffocating energy. Mark was kneeling in front of the creature, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as if in a trance. The friend tried to get a little closer, but terror consumed him. He knew that if he was seen, he might never return. What was happening there? What had Mark gotten involved in? All the protagonist knew was that it wasn't human, and that his friend, the creator of Facebook, was now in a game much more dangerous than anyone could imagine. Determined to discover the truth, he backed away carefully, barely able to breathe. He knew he couldn't tell anyone, not yet. In the days following that disturbing night, the protagonist could barely sleep. The images of what he had witnessed continued to haunt him. Mark kneeling before that strange figure, that intense light, and the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But his mind, naturally skeptical, tried to find rational explanations. Maybe he was interpreting everything wrong. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation for what he saw. He began to silently investigate, trying to piece together the puzzle. It was then that he began to notice strange patterns around Zuckerberg. The night trips continued, always to remote locations and never mentioned by Mark. The protagonist also noticed that Mark seemed to avoid discussions about advances in the Facebook project, as if he was always concerned about something other than the development of the platform. That's when he began to formulate a theory. What if Mark was involved in a government conspiracy? It wouldn't be the first time that governments have used technology companies to monitor the population. Perhaps he was secretly working with some intelligence agency, developing a tool that would allow them to control the flow of information on a large scale. Facebook, with its promise to connect the world, would be the perfect front for something much more sinister. This would explain the mysterious meetings, the shadowy figures, and Mark's increasingly strange behavior. Determined to find out more, the protagonist began discreetly asking questions among his Harvard classmates. No one seemed to know much, but some mentioned that Mark had contacts in elite circles, influential people who didn't show up at regular student gatherings. And stranger still, there were rumors that Zuckerberg was involved in something beyond the development of the platform. Something that, for many, sounded like pure speculation, even madness. But the protagonist couldn't help but think he was on the right path. The idea that Mark might be collaborating with the government made sense, at least initially. He began to hatch a plan to find out more, knowing that if he was right, he was approaching something very dangerous. It was one afternoon, in the middle of a discussion about the development of the Facebook interface, that the protagonist had his first glimpse of something that made him doubt his previous theories even more. He was sitting next to Mark and the other founders, reviewing the code and features, when he noticed a folder that Mark kept close to him with extreme care. This wasn't unusual, as Mark had always been protective of his notes, but something about that folder seemed different. In an unguarded moment, while Mark went to get a coffee, the protagonist, driven by curiosity, quickly opened the folder. What he found inside was not what he expected. Among complex diagrams and codes were what appeared to be schematics of devices he had never seen before. The pages were filled with strange symbols, writing he couldn't identify. It was as if the drawings described advanced technology, something far beyond human understanding. His heart raced. What he was seeing didn't look like something that belonged in this world. Those notes were not just software development, but something much more complex. Devices that, if they worked as described, could manipulate data at a level no human could ever imagine. They were capable of extracting information from people's minds, controlling entire communication networks with frightening precision, and even modifying patterns of behavior en masse. He quickly closed the folder when he heard Mark approaching. The protagonist tried to hide his shocked expression, but his mind was racing. The explanation of a government conspiracy no longer made sense. That level of technology was not something the United States government or any other world power could possess. He knew he had just seen something alien. From that moment on, it became clear to the protagonist that Mark was not just dealing with human forces. The technology he had envisioned was tangible proof that there was something bigger and more sinister behind Facebook. That platform, which seemed so innocent and innovative, was in fact the beginning of something much darker and more dangerous. Now, the protagonist had a new mission: to discover where that technology came from and what, or who, was behind it all. And most importantly, he needed to find out how involved Mark was in this extraterrestrial plan that was unfolding before his eyes. The days following the discovery of alien technology left the protagonist in a state of constant anxiety. He knew he was getting closer to a dangerous truth, a truth that could cost him more than his peace of mind. However, what he didn't yet know was how deep and frightening this truth could be. In the following weeks, he began to notice something even more disturbing. Mark Zuckerberg seemed to always be surrounded by figures who did not belong to the university's everyday life. On strange occasions, whether late at night or in little publicized meetings, the protagonist would see Mark being accompanied by individuals who did not mix with the other students or teachers. These mysterious figures had an almost ethereal presence, always silent, always at a distance, but their presence was palpable. These meetings took place in remote locations, almost always outside the busiest times on campus. The few students who passed by rarely noticed these figures, but the protagonist, now extremely attentive, did not miss any detail. Their appearances ranged from men in dark suits, with expressionless expressions and robotic behavior, to others who were almost invisible, as if they didn't want to be noticed. Who were these people? What were they doing with Zuckerberg? One night, while discreetly following Mark, the protagonist saw him enter a conference room inside an old, little-used building. He managed to find a strategic point to observe without being seen. What he witnessed there was even more disconcerting, a meeting that seemed straight out of a nightmare. Mark was talking to 3 of these enigmatic figures. The men did not speak, but rather communicated through subtle, almost imperceptible movements. The air in the room seemed dense, as if it were charged with a strange energy, something that left the protagonist in a state of alert. The silence was broken only by Mark's voice, who seemed to be receiving instructions from those beings. The words were incomprehensible to the protagonist, but he could feel the weight and seriousness of the conversation. It wasn't a simple business meeting or academic discussion. It was something much bigger, something beyond human comprehension. The protagonist stood there, frozen in fear, until Mark and the men left the room. He knew that from that moment on he was no longer dealing with theories or suspicions. There were forces involved that transcended our world. After witnessing the encounter with those enigmatic figures, the protagonist began to feel that his own life was being enveloped by something he could not control. At first they were small signs, a feeling of being watched, footsteps echoing behind him when he walked alone at night, or the sudden silence that took over the environment around him as if the world stopped for a brief moment. However, things started to get worse when he started receiving strange and cryptic messages, which led him to doubt his sanity. The first of these messages appeared in his university email. It was a message with no sender, with the subject line, "Be careful what you saw." In the body of the email, there was just one short sentence: "They know you're watching." The protagonist's heart raced, and he immediately deleted the email, but the impact had already been made. Who were they? Could it be the figures he had seen with Mark? And most disturbing, how did they know he was watching them? It wasn't long before supernatural signs began to manifest themselves in his everyday life. He began to have recurring nightmares, in which he saw himself trapped in a dark and suffocating environment, with tall, distorted-looking beings watching him, without saying a word. He would wake up in a cold sweat, with the feeling that something was wrong, but without knowing what. Until one day, something happened. He was sitting in his room, reviewing some college notes, when the air in the room began to become thick, as if something invisible was approaching. The sound of his own thoughts seemed louder, and suddenly his computer screen flickered. A message appeared on the screen, this time in plain text, without him having opened any program. "Stop investigating! You're being watched!" Panic took over him. How had this message appeared? Would it be Mark? Could it be the mysterious beings he saw him with? The feeling that forces beyond his understanding were now in control of his life was almost suffocating. He tried to tell some people he trusted, but no one believed him. He was isolated, not knowing who to trust or what to do. As the days passed, he received more signs. Strange electronic noises came from his devices, muted phone calls, and even shadows he caught glimpses of, as if he were always being followed. Paranoia was growing, but the protagonist knew one thing. He had crossed a line. Now, there was no going back. He was at the center of a game far bigger than he could ever imagine, and the forces in control weren't going to let him off the hook so easily. Now he had only one question left: how to survive what was to come. After weeks of living in constant paranoia, the protagonist knew he couldn't continue like this. He was being monitored, perhaps even manipulated, and his life would never be the same. However, there was one key piece in this entire puzzle that he had not yet directly confronted: Mark Zuckerberg. The young billionaire was at the center of everything, and the protagonist knew that to get answers, he would have to confront him personally. One night, while everyone was focused on another meeting about the development of Facebook, the protagonist decided to act. He knew that confronting Zuckerberg in public would not be wise, so he waited until the end of the meeting, when Mark, as usual, began quietly packing his things. With the room empty, the protagonist approached. "We need to talk, Mark," he said, his voice tense. Mark looked up slowly, his expression expressionless. For a moment it seemed like he knew exactly what was about to happen. "What do you think you know?" Mark replied, his voice low but carrying an unsettling calm. The protagonist felt a shiver run down his spine. He hadn't expected Mark to get straight to the point, and that disarmed him. "Still," he continued, "I saw you. I saw what you're doing, who you're seeing. This isn't normal. There's something else going on here, and I want to know the truth." Mark didn't hesitate. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Do you really believe you can understand what's at stake? It's not just you who's being watched. They're everywhere. Everything you think you know is just the tip of the iceberg." The protagonist took a step back, trying to process Mark's words. They? The confirmation that those figures, those mysterious entities, were not a figment of his imagination made panic grow within him. Mark smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they know they are in complete control. "You should have stayed away. It's too late now." Before the protagonist could react, Mark got up and left the room, leaving him there, frozen in a mix of fear and confusion. The confrontation didn't give him the answers he expected, but it confirmed something much worse. Mark wasn't just a creator of a social network. He was involved in something that transcended the real world, something much bigger and much more dangerous than anyone could imagine. After the confrontation with Zuckerberg, the protagonist knew there was no going back. Mark's words echoed in his mind. "They're everywhere." Who were they? Who or what was Mark referring to? The protagonist began to realize that what he was facing went far beyond a simple technological conspiracy or a government plot. He was dealing with something extraterrestrial, and sooner or later he would have to confront that truth head-on. That night he was seized by an irresistible impulse to go further in his investigation. It was as if something was guiding him, something beyond his own will. He knew where Mark would find himself that night, in a secluded area of campus, near a small forest. This was the place where Mark had held meetings before, and the protagonist was determined to find out what was really happening there. Hiding in the shadows, the protagonist watched as Mark arrived at the location. But this time, something different happened. An intense light began to shine in the sky, right above where Mark was. The protagonist froze, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. The light intensified with each second, and then he saw it. From within that light, figures began to materialize. They were tall, thin, with pale gray skin and large black eyes. Their forms seemed almost liquid, moving with a fluidity that defied any law of physics the protagonist knew. They were not human. They were the beings Mark was mentioning. They were they. The protagonist stood there, paralyzed, watching as Mark approached the creatures. There was no fear in Mark's eyes. On the contrary, he looked calm, as if he was meeting old friends. The creatures did not speak in the conventional way. There were no sounds or words. But something was happening between them and Mark, an invisible, telepathic communication that the protagonist could feel, even without understanding. It was at that moment that he realized. Mark Zuckerberg was not just an accomplice of these beings. He was in tune with them. Perhaps on some level, he was controlled by them. The answers the protagonist sought were finally before him, but now he understood that those answers came with a terrible price. He was dealing with an alliance between humans and extraterrestrials, a partnership that used Facebook as a tool for a purpose far darker than he could have imagined. What remained now was to discover how far this alien influence had spread, and more importantly, whether he still had any chance of escaping the reach of these forces that were now everywhere, watching his every move. The revelation of extraterrestrial beings brought to light a new and terrifying truth. Mark Zuckerberg was no longer the human genius that the world believed it knew. He was something much more dangerous. After the revelation of the alien beings, the protagonist became obsessed with understanding the true purpose of Facebook. He had already witnessed the presence of these beings and Mark's mysterious connection with them, but how exactly was a social network linked to something so big and incomprehensible? He needed to find out what was behind this technological facade, and he knew that the answer was hidden within Facebook's own system. The protagonist began to meticulously investigate the platform's source codes and internal structures. I spent sleepless nights analyzing patterns and variations in the data flow. What he discovered was alarming. There were entire parts of the system that made no sense, layers upon layers of encrypted coding that appeared to be connected to hidden servers, completely beyond the reach of authorities or any form of human control. This data was not just ordinary user information, they were detailed behavioral patterns collected and analyzed on a frightening scale. Facebook, he discovered, was not just a social network. It was an advanced global monitoring system. The ZUCKERBERG platform was designed to collect not only the obvious data that users voluntarily shared, their photos, posts, and interactions, but also to trace subconscious patterns. She analyzed how people reacted emotionally to certain stimuli, monitored their sleep cycles, mood, and even their physiological responses, such as heart rate and stress levels. All of this was done in a subtle, imperceptible way. Users thought they were just interacting with a social platform, but in reality they were being studied thoroughly, and things got even more sinister. The protagonist discovered that the data collected was not just used to target ads or personalize news feeds. They were being sent to servers directly controlled by the alien beings. Facebook was a tool of mass psychological control, used to map the human mind on a global scale, classifying people into different categories and preparing humanity for something much greater. What terrified him most was realizing that the platform was just the beginning. Facebook was being used to prepare the ground for a silent invasion. Humanity was being studied as if it were an experiment, and aliens were taking advantage of technology to learn how to manipulate human behaviors invisibly. The protagonist was now certain. Facebook was not a communication tool. It was a sophisticated weapon of mass control, developed by beings that did not belong to this planet. As the protagonist deepened his discoveries, he realized that he was no longer safe. The feeling of being watched, which had initially felt like paranoia, was now an inescapable reality. The alliance between Zuckerberg and aliens had eyes and ears everywhere, and those who dared to get too close to the truth, like him, became targets. It all started with small incidents. One night, upon returning to his dorm, he noticed that his laptop was open, something he would never let happen. His passwords had been changed and important files he had been secretly saving were corrupted. Shortly thereafter, he began receiving anonymous phone calls, with static on the other end of the line, but no response. It was as if he was being warned, but without words. A silent threat hung over him. Things got even more serious when he realized he was being followed. At first, they were just shadows in his peripheral vision, mysterious figures that disappeared whenever he tried to get closer. However, one afternoon as he walked to a meeting on campus, he clearly saw a man in a dark suit, standing at a safe distance but with his eyes fixed on him. The man didn't move. He didn't show emotion. He just watched. The protagonist quickened his pace and the man disappeared into the crowd. That night, when he returned to his dormitory, he found a message tucked under the door. "Stop investigating or there will be no going back." The note was short and to the point, but its impact was devastating. He knew that from that moment on, his life was in real danger. Mark, or whoever was in control, knew he was too close to the truth. However, the protagonist was torn. He knew that by continuing his investigation, he would put his life at risk. But at the same time, he was certain that what was at stake was much bigger than him. Facebook was just one part of a plan that involved the future of humanity, and it couldn't just stop. The threat of a silent invasion, where alien beings would control society through psychological manipulation, was real. The persecution intensified. Now he had the constant feeling that his movements were being monitored. Any attempt to seek help or tell the truth resulted in more pressure, more signs that her life was about to fall apart. He knew that sooner or later he would have to make a choice. Run away and save his own life, or continue and try to expose the secret that could change the fate of all humanity. As the threats and persecution became more intense, something even more disturbing began to happen to the protagonist. Not only did he feel like he was being watched, he also began to notice changes in his own mind. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Small memory gaps, confusion when trying to remember simple details, and even the feeling that some of his own thoughts weren't really his. As the days passed, these sensations became more intense and frightening. It all started with strange but vivid dreams. He repeatedly dreamed of the same alien figures he had seen alongside Zuckerberg. They didn't speak, but somehow he knew they were trying to communicate with him. In the dream, they extended their hands and he felt an inexplicable attraction, as if they were able to penetrate directly into his mind, manipulating his deepest emotions and thoughts. When he woke up, his body was sweaty, his mind tired, and the feeling of mental invasion was almost tangible. It was as if, even outside of the dream, they were still present. As the days passed, the mental manipulation became more evident. The protagonist began to have gaps in his memory, forgetting important conversations or losing track of time. He found himself in places he didn't remember going, as if he were being controlled by an outside force. It was as if his mind was being hacked, and he was losing control of his own life. At times he even questioned his sanity. Was it possible that everything he had discovered was a figment of his imagination? But whenever that doubt arose, some concrete evidence emerged to remind him of the truth. The alien encounters, the advanced technology he had encountered, and the threats that continued to haunt him. One particularly intense night, he woke up from yet another of these nightmares, feeling a crushing pressure on his mind. It was as if something was trying to take over his thoughts. Suddenly, he began to hear a voice that was not his own, but that came from inside his head. "Give up," the voice said repeatedly. "You cannot escape us. Your mind already belongs to us." The feeling was overwhelming, like being sucked into an abyss. He fought to maintain control of his mind, but every time he tried to focus, it was as if his own memories were being erased or rewritten. Aliens weren't just controlling Facebook and monitoring its data. They were directly manipulating the human mind, using technologies beyond comprehension. The protagonist knew he couldn't trust anyone. He was fighting a silent war, not just against Zuckerberg and the alien forces, but against his own mind. And with each passing day, I felt like I was losing. After weeks of persecution and mental manipulation, the protagonist finally reached a breaking point. He knew he needed definitive answers, that he needed to understand what was really happening, not just to him, but to humanity as a whole. The growing sense that he was just a piece in a much larger plan pushed him to act more desperately. It was then that, in an act of courage, he decided to return to that place where he had seen the aliens for the first time. The place was silent and deserted, as if nature itself knew that something dark was happening there. The air felt heavier, and the night was unnaturally dark. The protagonist headed towards the clearing in the forest, where the strange light had illuminated the previous encounter. This time, he knew there was no escape. He needed to face the truth head-on. To his surprise, as soon as he arrived at the place, a figure was already waiting for him. It wasn't Mark Zuckerberg, but one of the aliens he had seen before. The creature, tall and skeletal, approached with slow and calculated movements, without showing any intention of violence. But what came next was far more terrifying than any physical attack. Through telepathic means, the alien began to communicate with him, revealing truths that the protagonist could never have imagined. Humanity, he said, had been studied for centuries. The aliens, the species known as grises, had infiltrated human society so deeply that few suspected their presence. Facebook was just the latest in a long series of tools created to monitor, categorize, and control humanity. The real plan, however, was even darker. The aliens weren't just interested in observing humans. They were preparing Earth for a complete transition. a forced integration between humanity and its own species. The ultimate goal was not invasion in the traditional sense, but a total merging of minds and consciousnesses. Facebook's digital platform, with its vast network of information and psychological control, was key to this process. The alien revealed that soon, a great transformation would happen. Humanity would be divided into two categories: those who would voluntarily submit to alien control and those who would resist but be eliminated. Facebook was setting the stage for this choice by manipulating emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. And for the protagonist, it was clear that this transformation had already begun. Every move, every action humans took online was being monitored and adjusted for a greater purpose. He felt a chill go up his spine as he realized that, in fact, no one was safe. Facebook was not a communication tool. It was an instrument of mass control, a globe-spanning network that now became the means through which the aliens would implement their complete dominance over Earth. Humanity's fate was sealed, and the question that remained was, could he do something about it before it was too late? With the revelation of humanity's fate still echoing in his mind, the protagonist felt the weight of responsibility that now fell on his shoulders. He was one of the few who knew the truth. I knew that Facebook was not just a platform, but an advanced alien mind control mechanism. I knew that humanity was on the verge of a forced transition, where human minds would be assimilated by an extraterrestrial force. And above all, he knew that his life was in real and imminent danger, but he was not willing to give up. Despite mental manipulation, constant threats, and the fear that plagued him with every move, the protagonist decided he needed to act. He had to expose the truth, even if it cost his own life. Having decided, he began to draw up a plan. He knew that revealing something so big wouldn't be easy, and Zuckerberg's allies, human or otherwise, would do everything they could to silence him. The first step was to find a way to get the public to believe your story. He began gathering all the evidence he had: copies of the cryptic Facebook codes, the alien schematics he had discovered, and detailed records of his observations. He also documented his own experiences, the encounters with mysterious figures, the attempts at mental manipulation, and the threats he had received. As he collected this evidence, he realized he needed an audience that was beyond Facebook's control. Social networks were completely compromised, and any attempt to disseminate this information directly through them would be censored or manipulated. He decided to turn to underground internet forums, encrypted channels, and groups that were already suspicious of large corporations and their hidden agendas. These groups might be skeptical, but they were also the most likely to investigate on their own. However, before he could execute his plan, things took an unexpected turn. One day, while preparing for a meeting with an independent journalist, one of the few who did not yet have ties to large media corporations, the protagonist realized that he was being followed again. This time, however, it was not a simple surveillance. He was being hunted. Those who wanted to stop him from exposing the truth were willing to do anything, and he knew that his next decision could be his last. The fight for the truth had reached its climax. He needed to make a choice, risk everything to try to save humanity, or run away and save himself. The fate of the battle was in his hands, and time was running out. With the chase intensifying and the pressure reaching an unbearable level, the protagonist knew he could not continue fighting alone. He needed allies, a support network that believed in him, and was willing to help reveal the truth about Zuckerberg and the aliens. But with most traditional means compromised, their options were limited. And it was in this moment of desperation that he made a risky decision. He would go straight to the heart of the problem. In a last act of courage, or perhaps desperation, the protagonist infiltrated a technology conference where Zuckerberg was presenting the new expansion guidelines for Facebook, now called Meta. Security was intense, and the event was packed with powerful executives, journalists, and influencers from around the world. It was the perfect setting for what the protagonist planned: a public and unquestionable revelation. He knew he couldn't rely on the traditional press, so he prepared a live broadcast for an encrypted channel he had secretly created. His plan was to hack the conference's audiovisual system and display all the evidence he had gathered: the alien codes, the evidence of mind manipulation, and the dark revelations about the fate of humanity. Everything would be revealed at once, and the entire world would see the truth. At the crucial moment when Zuckerberg took the stage to give his speech, the protagonist took action. He connected his device to the conference system, and for a few seconds, the giant screens displayed the content he had prepared. Photos of alien encounters, mind control schemes, evidence that Facebook was preparing humanity for a merger with extraterrestrial beings. But then, something unexpected happened. Before he could complete his transmission, the system was knocked down. The screens went blank, and the room fell into a tense silence. The protagonist desperately tried to regain control, but it was too late. Security found him, and he was quickly detained and taken to a secluded area. On the way, he saw Zuckerberg walking past him, expressionless, fearless. There was something deeply disturbing about Mark's calm. He knew that the protagonist had come too far, but at the same time he seemed to know that he would never be able to win. The days that followed were hazy. The protagonist was kept in a secret location, interrogated in ways that defied logic and sanity. In his mind, fragments of reality mixed with memories of alien manipulation. He knew the truth was out there, but the battle was far from won. When he was finally released, or perhaps released on purpose, the story he had tried to reveal to the world had been erased. There were no records of its transmission, the evidence disappeared, and no one remembered what had happened. Facebook continued to grow, and Meta expanded more and more, now with a reach that surpassed any human control. The protagonist, now a shadow of himself, lived with the certainty that something terrible was coming. He had failed to stop the plan, but he knew this was just the beginning. The future of humanity was sealed, and Facebook, or Meta, was just the harbinger of something much more sinister. The end of your journey? Ambiguous. He had touched the truth, but it was still far from the reach of most. Humanity continued its life, connected and monitored, without knowing that what was to come could not be avoided. The story we just told raises disturbing questions about the power of technology and the possible hidden intentions behind platforms we use every day. How well do we really know the scope of the companies that collect our information? Are we unknowingly handing over more than just personal data? The connection between Zuckerberg and alien forces, although fictional in this narrative, makes us wonder, what if large technological corporations are just pieces of something bigger, something we can't even imagine? What is your opinion on this? Do you think we could be being manipulated without realizing it? If you like this story and want to continue following our stories of horror, mystery, and conspiracy, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your opinion is very important to us, so leave your comment below and stay tuned for the next stories to come. Until next time.